joining us from Spain as well. So feel free to comment where you're coming from. We'll start at the top of the hour here and get going. If you're joining us from Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, feel free to comment in any of those channels. We'll make sure that your questions, your comments get over to the discussion as well. You can also join us live on Zoom to be a part of the conversation directly as well. Go to detroit.aiga.org, click on events, and you'll find a link there. Cool. So it looks like we are at noon. So I'm going to start here with, we're going to be talking with Sunday Afternoon today. Get ready for some great discussion about agencies and what it's like to work with talent and having a good client relationship as well. A couple other housekeeping notes. We're going to be chatting with Makers Company on the 9th, tomorrow. They're a duo from South Africa. They'll be joining us. Feel free to register for that too. We're going to be talking with Detroit photographer Matt Levere on the 11th as well. So definitely look there if you're a photography fan and fan of some like great local work. And then on the 12th, we're going to be talking with Beetroot, a design group based out of Greece. So we're just traveling all over the world this week. And then on the 15th, be sure to join us for an early morning conversation, bright and early, 9 o'clock, with Rice Creative, a studio group based out of Vietnam, which will be really fun to talk to. So put it in your calendars, get an alarm going. We'll be sure to have a great morning discussion there. We also want to call out the movement that's happening right now. AIGA Detroit, as you know, supports Black Lives Matter. All these chats that we do for free. And we want to make sure that if you want to support local organizations, local people, we want you to spend some of your money donating and supporting these orgs as your thanks for helping us putting these sort of chats on. A couple ones I wanted to shout out: the Detroit Justice Center, which is a nonprofit law firm that helps people in the local area deal with the criminal justice system. They also run the local version of bail.org. So if you donate to them and the bail fund, you can help people dealing with incarceration as well. Michigan Liberation Group is another group doing similar work, specifically around making sure that communities of color, Black communities aren't being overly policed, and looks to end the mass policing and incarceration system. Definitely a really great organization. There's also the Michigan Solidarity Bail Fund, which is helping people who are protesting and have been arrested, thrown in jail as a result of exercising their First Amendment rights. And also, given that it is Pride Month as well, I also want to shout out the Ruth Ellis Center, an organization close to my heart, which helps LGBTQIA youth, and particularly youth of color, deal with issues of homelessness, mental health, education, and employment. They're a really great local organization that I hope all of you toss some money at. All these great organizations could really use your support always, but definitely during this time, it's a really good time to show your support for what's going on. Two other things too. DMJ Studios, run by Donna Jackson, is putting on 2 poster contests that are also pretty relevant. The Posters on Politics project, which she's been doing since 2017, and the World After, which is discussing what the new normal is going to look like after we recover from COVID-19. You can sign up, see some more info at dmjstudio.com. So with all that being said, let's chat with Sunday Afternoon. Maria, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. Thank you, Dylan. And for those of you that are tuning in, Dylan is our AIGA Detroit president. So thank you, Dylan, for that introduction. And as Dylan mentioned, Zoom Chats is a free weekly live stream that we host. We're doing these through the end of this month, through the end of June. So just tune in every week. We have the different guest creatives that we're going to be featuring listed on our website, and that's also where you can register for these Zoom calls that we're doing. With that being said, I'm really excited to introduce both Audrie Poole and Juan Carlos Pagan. Really excited to have you guys here representing Sunday afternoon. So with that being said, Audrie and Juan Carlos, feel free to introduce yourselves, and we'll get started today in the discussion centered around what it's like to work not only for a design studio like Sunday afternoon, but having an agent and a rep representing you as a creative in your work, and what that's like for our industry. So feel free to kick it off.
Awesome. Thank you for having us. Audrie, I'll let you introduce yourself first.
Okay, cool. Hi, I'm Audrie Poole. I am the lead agent and executive producer for Sunday Afternoon. And I was brought on by Juan Carlos and Ahmed Klink in the very early days of Sunday Afternoon's creation back in the, what was that, 2017?
17?
Yeah.
My early days, she means like day one.
Well, it was maybe like day 3.
Maybe.
So.
Yeah, I'm Juan Carlos Pagan. I am the co-founder, creative director of Sunday Afternoon. And like you guys were mentioning earlier, Sunday Afternoon is a bit of a weird beast. It's a two-headed monster in the sense that on one hand, we have a design studio internally that we handle a series of clients. And we also have a part of Sunday Afternoon that represents the interests of 10 artists at the moment. So we kind of juggle the two. And I think what makes us unique is that we're allowed to sort of pull the artists on the roster onto design studio projects. We all sort of feed off of the creativity that happens sort of internally, right? Whether that project comes into the studio or through the artists, we all get to share and kind of collaborate in a weird sort of creative family kind of way. Is that right, Audrie?
Yeah. You know, ultimately as a, you know, I'm one of the first faces that a lot of our clients sort of interact with. So often I'm looking for opportunities, and also part of my process is to sort of educate would-be collaborators about, like, you know, basically the flexibility of what our group sort of can offer. So Juan Carlos, as our executive creative director, will often, you know, be the head of projects, and I represent him in a couple of different ways, whether it be sort of more illustrative projects for like the New York Times as an example, or for identity projects where I'm using some of my, you know, other experience to sort of help shape and create, you know, sort of project management style experience for our clients. And then whenever I can, you know, you know, we believe that we represent some of the best artists in, you know, in the country and in the world, really. So whenever there's an opportunity that needs like illustration or photography, often, you know, our resource will be that we start to think about them if they're a fit, you know, depending on what it is.
Yeah, I also think there's like, you know, something we were thinking a lot about when we were starting Sunday Afternoon was the idea of creative scaling. A lot of times people will come to me and they will want a singular thing, whether it be a magazine cover or an illustration for something very specific. But other times we would get projects that needed to scale up, whether it's an identity for a large sort of company where it would require my effort and the efforts of a bunch of other creatives and strategy people. So we wanted to structure the studio and Sunday Afternoon in such a way where we can scale in a smart way based on the project and the needs of our clients.
And then the other thing that's sort of unique about Sunday Afternoon is that we not only encourage, but, you know, are constantly trying to make opportunities within the roster for them to collaborate with one another or use each other as resources. So I've seen some pretty radical stuff amongst our, you know, illustrators, type artists, and our photographers in particular, where rather than everybody be siloed and I'm the only person that they communicate with, which I feel like, you know, I think there are a lot of agencies where people sort of communicate inter-roster where, you know, you have respect for your, you know, your agency mates, for lack of a better, but we really strive to create sort of, you know, a family atmosphere where people know that if they have a question or you know, have an idea, that they have us to sort of bounce that off of. And I, you know, sort of reposition them depending on like, hey, I think it would be a good idea if you guys chatted about XYZ. And often they do, and they've found friendship within that, which has been really, really cool.
Yeah, I think that's hugely important because there's a lot of sort of like huge, like really big sort of artist management agencies that like fill a certain void. We're a different kind of place and a different kind of home, and we have a very limited, small roster, and that is precisely because we want our artists to collaborate with each other, and we put different artists next to each other that feel like they could build something bigger together versus like just throwing artists on a roster just to keep the wheels burning. That's kind of not our jam. We think smaller is good. We think collaboration is great. We want to foster that. Is there questions, or are we going to keep we can keep rambling?
I mean,
well, could you maybe talk a little bit about how you guys got started, like with Sunday Afternoon? Like, how did you guys meet? How did you build up, you know, the creative base that you guys have with the artists and the creatives that you represent, and maybe talk a little bit about that background?
Yeah, it's a good question. Back in 2017, myself and Ahmed Clegg were both having conversation. He's a friend of mine. So Ahmed, who's not on this on this panel, but he's a co-founder as well. He's a director and a photographer. At that time, he was being loosely represented by another agent, but he was looking to switch agents maybe. And we were having conversations around what an agency should look like and feel like, and the kind of place we wanted to be repped by. I was also being courted by a few places. So that led to a conversation that kept building, which led to what we thought Sunday Afternoon could be, right? So it was just fortuitous that me and him were kind of at the same place. I mean, he was working for a couple more years as like a professional freelance like director and photographer, and I was coming out of the advertising world, going into more sort of typographic illustration and identity work, doing that on my own. But we were both kind of meeting at the same place, and we were good friends. So one conversation led to another, led to, you know, well, why don't we just create the place that we've been talking about, right? This kind of dual studio artist rep company that can kind of feed each other different projects in different kind of ways and foster the kind of community that we wanted to see. And we were lucky enough to have people around us that can help facilitate it and make this from like a concept into a reality. I knew Audrie since 2011, maybe. She was a rep at LL Reps. We worked together because she repped Sean Freeman. Me and Sean collaborated on a project when I was the creative director at DDB, and we became friends ever since. So she immediately came to mind. We had a couple of other artists friends who were looking for representation, who we had conversations with, and everything sort of kind of pieced together. We got super lucky. Like the timing was really great, right, Audrie?
Yeah, no, it was perfect. And
yeah,
you know, we've created this very interesting sort of model where there really isn't another group. There really aren't other groups out there. And like, you know, I at the time when Sunday Afternoon started was an art producer for a design studio and creative operations. And the idea of what Juan Carlos and Ahmed were sort of putting together sounded like the perfect combination of elements. And I was like, wow, this is really interesting. And, you know, Juan Carlos and I had worked together on some projects together, and I had been following him for a really long time and trying to hire him as a freelancer. Every opportunity I got, he never said yes to me. So I, when he came and he was like, hey, I have this thing, I was like, okay, sure. Like, this sounds amazing. And like, you know, 6 months later, I was like, okay, let's do this. Let's make something of it. And it's been a wild ride ever since.
Yeah, the ball moved pretty quickly from like conception to like reality. And I think that's because the pieces kind of like fell into place. I think there's this like weird idea that like if you put something into the universe, it just starts like helping you get what you want. And I think that's the case with Sunday Afternoon. We had this idea, we had the right people around us. We worked our asses off, but like the universe was just putting the pieces in front of us and we were just making the connections. So it seems super easy, but I mean, it was a lot of work, but it was just us putting the puzzle pieces together. And then, you know, what's the saying? Like, if you build it, they will come. We built it. And then luckily clients started coming through and wanting to do some work with us.
Yeah.
Nice. And then Sunday afternoon as a studio, as an agency, like how large of a group is it? Like, and how does that selection process look like? Because I know you guys work with people that do illustration, photography, motion graphics. So how, like, creatives that might be listening to this conversation, whether they're here in Zoom, on Facebook Live, or our other platforms, what does that selection process look like if you want to be repped by Sunday afternoon?
Yeah, Audrie, I'll let you go first because I think you're closer to this than I am in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I mean, first off, it's the selection process is something that Ahmed, Juan Carlos, and I work together on, and often, and so far in our tenure, which is, you know, only 4 years now, ultimately, you know, what we're looking for is diversity in the roster and something that's really different from the artists that we currently have. So our selection process, it doesn't come in one way. Like, we found artists through Young Guns. We found artists that have come, you know, sort of, you know, through, you know, having, you know, requested that we, you know, take an interest in their work. We've found people through Instagram and beyond. There isn't one way to sort of get to us. It really, one of the most important things to us is that that their work has a unique voice to themselves, and that ultimately that, you know, they represent something very different from what the rest of our artists are doing. It's really important to us that our artists are not interchangeable. So while we may have different artists that are working in the same discipline, so, you know, Juan Carlos in particular, like, we have a couple of artists that are, you know, that do, you know, typographic work, but I don't know that anybody would confuse what Juan Carlos does with somebody like Ben Johnson or Nick Masani. They're all very, you know, very unique in of themselves, and that's really super important to us.
Yeah, that's hugely important to us. We want to make sure our artists feel like they own their own sort of corner within the roster versus feeling like, you know, just one of many. That has been at the sort of core of Sunday afternoon since the beginning. And that has a lot to do with, you know, collaboration, but also making sure our artists don't feel just like another like cog in the wheel. You know, we pride ourselves in making sure that each person has a point of view and they're fostering their point of view and we're helping them along, and we're not just stacking the deck. I don't think that's a great way of having artist management agency. It's not ourselves. So we're looking for artists who have a strong point of view and don't look like any other artists on our roster. You know, if it's unfortunate, right? Because we'll see some really talented people who email us, like super talented people, but if they're like, oh, this is too close to Josh Dickinson, or this is too close to Ahmed Klink, we would have to send them an email being like, hey, you're amazing, but maybe you're just not like the right fit for us. You're gonna get picked up somewhere. But we have that sort of filled with one of our artists, and we're not interested in having our artists feel like they're competing with someone else on the roster. That's not the vibe we want to have.
I often get, you know, I'll get, you know, requests from agency producers being like, who do you have that does this? And it's like, usually it's like, I have one person who does whatever they're asking for. Or, you know, if the ask is very general, it's like, you know, we have no intention of ever being the kind of agency that represents people where it's like, oh, if so-and-so is not available, then you can just work with fill in the blank. Or they're the less expensive option of that, because it's not, you know, while I think that model definitely works for a lot of agencies, and I don't disagree with how they run that, because we're trying to own the creative in a lot of ways, and the studio was sort of born out of the idea that since so many of our artists also have started out with, particularly our, like, you know, we have a lot of artists on our roster that were also creative directors, art directors, designers. And because they were also, and in some cases still are working, you know, in that capacity, it's really, you know, difficult for us to sort of think about like, okay, we're just going to fill this one role. It's like our team is predisposed to be able to think more globally about projects and really offer up a lot in terms of the process. You know, like we had even our photographers at this point, like we're all sort of trained to be sort of strategically thinking, and it's not just about the project at hand. It's about, you know, also understanding the implication. It's like, what are, you know, one of our photographers, Josh, often, you know, it often is doing brand imagery. So this is how a brand will go out and sort of speak the language of their visuals through photography. And he's gotten, you know, particularly great at, you know, being able to understand what the point and what the goal is, and not just sort of like, okay, you need, you know, oranges, you know, along with your product. So
I see here in chat that Josh is actually in here and says, Juan Carlos stole my leave behind from producers. There's story behind that.
No, I steal all of Josh's stuff. We share a studio, so if he leaves it, I'm going to steal it.
Yeah, but the way we found him wasn't, didn't you steal his one of his books when you were at 72?
So the story behind that was that he went to visit our producer at 72 and Sunny. I was a creative director at 72 and Sunny. She showed me his leave behind. I stole it from her, and I emailed him personally, being like, hey, we're starting this artist management company. Do you want to sign with us? And he was like, yeah, okay, cool. So that's how it happened. The way we find artists can be, it's by hook or crook, right? Like it's by either Instagram or the email. So I'm stealing something from someone and I'm emailing them on the low. So yeah, if I'm interested in the work or the art, like you're going to get an email for sure. Even if it's just to say hi.
Yeah.
Nice. Quick question. So on that note, Juan Carlos, so are you guys looking right now? I know animation, motion graphics, more like dynamic work like that, that's interactive. Are you guys actively seeking that right now? Like as far as maybe what you're looking to add to the roster of the creatives that you guys represent or as a studio?
I mean, Audrie can say no to this, but I don't necessarily think at the moment we're interested in adding too much more to the roster right now. I think we have a really great group of artists that we rep. I think we have a really good balance. Audrie is already overworked, so we don't want to add more work to her plate. But yeah, I think as we continue to move and have a discussion around the roster, it's a pretty like evolving conversation where sometimes we're like, well, we should have another photographer. Sometimes we should have another illustrator, but it's constantly evolving. But at the moment, I don't think there's any interest to add to the roster. Audrie, tell me if I'm wrong.
I mean, I think it's important to note that the way that we onboard and bring artists on is, you know, we're not interested in just putting a portfolio on the website, you know. You know, the way that we cultivate and work with our artists, you know, I'm not sure, I can't speak to what other people do, but I know that for me, it's really important that I have a really succinct understanding about what the artist's goals are. And to the best of our ability, you know, sort of try to help them achieve those goals. And then also, you know, help them and encourage our artists to create work that speaks to those genres. So our process isn't short, and having an agent isn't like you get on a roster and tomorrow you get your first job. In fact, it can be a really long time before you see the fruits of everybody's labor. So I've been in the place where, especially with COVID, you know, and, you know, I think we've all, you know, we are not spared from that in any way, shape, or form. So it's important to me that everybody that I'm working with right now get the kind of attention that as things start to move back into the direction of projects and photo shoots and all of that, that everybody's getting what they need. And I don't want to divide my attention. You know, frankly, the thing that we've talked about is, you know, people in the sort of the CG place, you know, in terms of artists. But you know, I'm kind of reticent to be like, hey, come on over, let's add 5 more artists, because it just doesn't coalesce with how we, you know, approach representation to begin with.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, just to give you some context, one of the last illustrators that we added to the roster, we had an 8-month conversation with him before he joined the roster. I mean, that was
yeah.
I mean, like we're building a relationship. It's not just signing a piece of paper. I mean, I speak to Audrie more than I speak to my mom. That's a fact. So
most of the artists do.
I mean, that says lots of how kind of intense like your relationship is with your rep. You're dealing with that person on a day-to-day, and we really need to know that the artists that we bring on board respect that and understand that.
Oh, Mikey just said, call your mom.
I actually really need to. I really need to call my mom. For sure. I will. Yeah.
But I mean, that's the thing. It's like, you know, for me, and because Sunday Afternoon is a younger business, you know, there's a lot that we do, that Juan Carlos and I do together, you know, from individual projects where, you know, if he's, you know, designing a cover for the New York Times, or we're working on an identity project, you know, there are days where I call him like 17 times. I was like, are you sick of me yet? Like, let me ask you 900 other questions that I forgot on the last 6 phone calls. But you know, with some of my artists, like, you know, we talk, you know, it depends. It really depends on the individual, because my relationship with many of them is very specific to what their needs are. So I have artists that as they create work, they like feedback. So, you know, I'll give them feedback. And then there's also, you know, the element of, you know, if we're talking about like, you know, and this is part of my process, which is, if we identify brands and agencies and styles of work that each individual artist wants to be working in, that they aren't currently, but their portfolio doesn't necessarily support them getting those projects, then we dive into making work together that speaks to that. Because, you know, I think that, you know, we fundamentally believe that our creative partners, that our agencies and brands, you know, can speak the same language we do, but we also know that sometimes selling it through to clients needs a little bit of help. So, you know, sometimes I look at projects and I was like, you know, this is great, but I think we need to be more in this zone. And, you know, we go back and forth, and some artists like love that, and some don't desire it, don't want it. And I kind of leave them to lead that. And sometimes I'm, you know, opinionated and probably push too hard, but you know, that's what mom does, right? Like,
yes. I'm sorry. There's bells going off. I'm like super close to like a church. So if you hear bells going off, it's a local church.
Yeah, we don't hear it.
Okay, cool.
But thank you though. But no, that's a really great point too, Audrie. So I'm glad you brought that up. And I think also just having that push, I think, is also helpful. Like just to kind of, I think creatively even, what you mentioned, you know, whether it's creating something that represents the artist, you know, in a specific light or in a specific direction, to showcase that other side of them that maybe the portfolio does not support. With that being said, I know we're already close to 12:30, so I'm gonna go ahead and open up the floor to questions from the audience now. So for those of you that are tuning in here in Zoom, make sure that feel free to ask as many questions as you like to Audrie, to Juan Carlos, to both of them. Feel free to use that Q&A button that's here in Zoom. And for those of you that are tuning in, whether through Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook, feel free to write out your questions in the comment section, and we'll get that over to both Audrie and Juan Carlos. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and open up the floor to questions. And while people are typing away, I guess, could you give a recent example of a project that you and Juan Carlos collaborated on, and maybe talk through like what that process looked like, from maybe getting, whether that was the client reaching out to you guys or you guys reaching out to the client, and then the actual process of creating a specific piece. And maybe just kind of give us some context of what that looks like between the two of you.
Audrie, do you have something in mind? Do you have
You want to talk about Gen Z?
Yeah, we can talk about Gen Z. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So like those projects that like tend to get handled in the studio, which requires a lot of design help and that's mostly sort of campaign work and identity work that we do. So for like NPR or stuff for Moody or Pouch, you'll see sort of larger case studies that really require sort of a team effort. Sometimes we're lucky enough to work directly with like the New York Times to do a cover. And that's when they're coming to me specifically for a thing. And usually that process is such where me and Audrie will get an email, or I'll get an email and I quickly funnel that email over to Audrie, and then Audrie does her magic. So I'll let you take over, Audrie.
And actually, maybe we should talk about NPR. That's a great one.
Let's do Gen Z, and then we'll do NPR.
Okay. Yeah. So, like JC said, like ultimately projects can come in through a lot of different ways. Like, my efforts are that I am, ultimately through we leverage our social media a lot. And then, I'm also doing sparing emailers, just because I know how intense that is and how hard it is for people to keep up with promotional emails. But often clients will come through, either they'll reach out to me directly, they'll come through our website, or they'll come to the individual artists. And I sort of set the cadence. So often, particularly with Juan Carlos, I sort of run them through a whole bunch of questions, which are like, which would be if it's illustration or identity based, like, although it's not radically different, it's like, what are we trying to accomplish? What is the timing that we're looking for? And all of those sort of preliminary things around timing and need and budget. And once I want as much as I can get out of them in terms of that stuff. And then once I have a lot of that established, because JC's calendar and our studio calendar tends to be pretty hectic at times. So we need to make the determination about whether or not we have the bandwidth. And once we say, like, thumbs up, we're good, let's do this, then I'll do the next phase, which is arranging a phone call, and then we review any brief that might be available as a part of the project. And then I make that connection. And then particularly with Juan Carlos and our studio, I'm usually setting the cadence for the calendaring. So when we're going to be doing reviews and rounds, when we are, making those connections via, in this day and age, well, mostly we do phone calls anyway, or teleconferences like Zoom or Uber conference. But I'm usually responsible for sort of setting all of that kind of stuff up to get and, put all of the people together. I'm also, for all of the artists, I do all the scope management. So I'm responsible for helping create or respond to the scope. And then I'm also responsible for enforcing it. So, which is, I think, probably one of the best things about having an agent, which is once it starts to get a little wild, it's a lot easier for me to go back and say, hey, remember how we said 3 rounds, or, give a warning shot of like, okay, we like to be flexible, but we need to start to rein in or make some decisions or talk about an extension of scope. And see where that, what goes on next.
Yeah, I mean, we're super lucky. Audrie makes our lives really easy. Like, we get to like make stuff. We get to really sort of play with crayons and be kids, and she makes like, life manageable. And she plays bad cop when we're playing good cop. So, we have sort of a system in place now that I think is pretty like well oiled, but it's pretty good. We don't reach out to clients in a traditional sense. We're not like, hey, let's do work for you. We do sort of like broad sort of like outreach through social and through like our relationships with like producers or clients. But we're never we're never like actively seeking clients. We're lucky enough that people who have worked with us in the past still like working with us, and they'll have, we have return visits, and we get to do work that way. Yeah, we'll get RFPs. So I think if we switch over to something like NPR, that's where we'll get sort of a more traditional sort of RFP process, which it's a slightly more involved, where we're putting together a proposal based on a request for work. And then that conversation again, Audrie will tend to handle most of those beginning sort of like conversations after we put together a proposal based on RFP.
Yeah, and like we work collaboratively on the RFPs. So in terms of if we're being asked to sort of provide the scope and schedule and all of that, like I'll work on that, with Juan Carlos and Ahmed, and then we'll assemble our case studies together and sort of, based off of what the ask is and what they've shown us, like what within our portfolio feels appropriate, and sort of answers the questions that they've had. And NPR was an interesting one because they came, I think, Juan Carlos and our team has done a ton of award-winning work. So I feel like that one came through, and that's why I think we enter into those contests, because it definitely provides some visibility. And for me, it's great because I get to celebrate everybody and the hard work that they've done, because it's pretty badass.
Yeah, well, RFPs with NPR is a bit different, because then let's say we get awarded the project, they brief us, and then myself and Ahmed will brief the team, and we'll manage sort of the internal day-to-day check-ins with the rest of the team and how the work is coming along, while Audrie is like sort of managing sort of the client relationships and the punctuation points when we have to check in with them, when we have to jump on a call and have a conversation with them. So there's sort of like two timelines happening, where one sort of like a macro timeline, then Ahmed and myself are dealing with more of the creative micro timelines, where we're seeing the work and we're helping with the team, come up with ideas and throw concepts at the wall and put together presentations, which we can then share with NPR.
Yeah, and NPR in particular, because that one was multifaceted and there was an event tied to it. And we not only did we do all of the design, but then there was also a booth that they were doing. So we had to design the booth itself and the experience that they were having. So there was a heavy production element to it. So we were also facilitating and communicating with another group outside in order to make sure that everything was sort of made. And, all within 2 weeks, it felt like, maybe, 2 weeks.
That was a pretty aggressive timeline, but they were great partners to work with.
They were amazing. Like,
they all worked right away, and they were okay. This is great, and they didn't like dilly-dally. They made pretty decisive moves, which made our lives easier. Sometimes tight deadlines can be your friend. It forces your clients to make decisions, which is good.
All right, thank you very much, Juan Carlos and Audrie. Looks like we have a lot of questions coming in, so we'll pivot to the Q&A section. But before we go there was just a comment from Ahmed. He said, JC, how was that epic paella dish that you posted on your Instagram story?
I was going to ask you about that.
It was life-changing. It was my first like proper like paella that I've ever had in my life. This is my first time in Spain, so it was life-alteringly good. It was really good.
Looks so
nice.
Good.
Well, enjoy it and load up on it, Juan Carlos.
No, I'm going to turn into a circle while I'm here. I plan on it.
And no, during lunchtime, I think all of our stomachs are growling just even talking about food. So on another topic, because I have a bowl of food here I'm waiting to eat. Through the Q&A session, this is just addressed to both of you, so feel free to either address it collectively, or if one or either of you want to address it. First question here is, tell us a time about a project that went bad.
Oh, bad. I don't want to name clients' names, but there was a particular food brand that we worked with, and And it went bad, not because they were bad people or because like we had a stupid argument. You know, it was the fact that I don't think we were aligned, right? So there was someone on the client end that was sort of making the decisions, and they had someone who hired us. So between the chain of commands, everyone had sort of a different agenda or an idea of what the project should ultimately be. And I think it fell apart because of that. We just all weren't aligned. Audrie, you know what I'm talking about, right? What project? Yeah.
Yeah, that was actually the one I was thinking about too.
Yeah.
One of the things that our studio doesn't, like, we don't employ a strategist as a part of our studio team. We have fabulous strategists that we work with when projects require them, and that's usually a part of my, the first questions that I'm asking, especially when a client comes with an identity need. More than 50% of the time, by the time they get to us, they've sometimes we get brought in by other strategy groups who are already doing that work, and then their desire is to have us work on the design. But all of our identity is foundationally based on that strategy, and I think that particular project, I don't know that there was universal agreement about their strategy and a way for them to even enforce it amongst themselves. So the project kind of, it kind of spun out ultimately because, when you don't have that to guide you, and everybody isn't in 100% agreement about the direction that you're supposed to be going and the why you're redoing your identity, frankly, it's really hard to sort of hit that nail on the head and get the identity into a place that everybody feels really happy with. So that particular project ended prematurely.
Yeah.
Which was a bummer.
There's another question here. It says, what is your dream project and or dream client?
I think we all probably have different answers for this. I'm sure if Ahmed were here, he would have one. I know Audrie probably has her own. We had a conversation earlier this year about working a lot more with sort of organizations and non-for-profits that we personally all believe in. So we have, oddly enough, been having conversations with some of those organizations, and unfortunately, COVID put a sort of a halt in some of those discussions. But there are a couple of sort of like civil rights non-for-profits that we're continuously having conversations with. So I feel like my dream clients are within like arm's reach. Audrie, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think, as Sunday afternoon has sort of gotten its feet under itself, us being able to sort of really define, the kind, not only the work that we can do that will be noteworthy, but then also has that, has an effect. So working on behalf of organizations that we feel strongly about, that we think moves the needle, is really important to us. And then there's the other piece, which is, it goes back to the spirit of our, of what Sunday afternoon is about, which is that collaboration between clients. Like my other bucket is about, how many times can I bring multiple artists from our roster, not only to work on different parts of the same project, but also potentially to work together on those projects. And we've gotten to do that a number of times in ways that it feels pretty unique. And so more of that is my dream. More opportunities to sort of blend our roster together when we can, or even, bring in, appropriate people into the mix. Cause I just feel like we're all better when we do stuff, as a group.
Audrie, to your point, what you just mentioned also, in being able to bring in, additional people, this kind of pivots to a question that Lila here has a question. She says, do you ever have to outsource or hire creative for one project? Is that something you do, or does that, hold on, does that assign for you that you need to add? So is that something that you guys do, or is that a sign that you need to add to your roster? She wants to know.
I mean, so, this is one of the, and I said it before, in terms of like, if we were adding, it's like probably the place that we run against more than once is a need against CG. But the reality is that I need to be able to, it isn't necessarily a signal that I need to bring on a CG artist, though I would like to, so much as because I feel like particularly people that work very well in that discipline, their needs and how they function as an individual is very different than maybe some other artists. So but yes, we've explored that before. We've bid out with CG artists, and ultimately, and I mean, on the design front, like when we have needs that are beyond what our capacity is, we've done that. But my and our process against taking on artists is so very specific and so individualized that I just can't add somebody all willy-nilly like, oh, hey. That just doesn't feel good to me. It just feels like I'm not going to serve them and I'm not going to serve the other artists that are on our roster properly in order to do that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Audrie. And then there's another question, probably geared towards you as well. It says, how do you handle a project that starts to go out of scope?
It depends on what's happening. So, I mean, this is like JC and I were just having this conversation last week where we're working on something and, the call and response that we're doing on this particular project, definitely it's gotten to that noodly part where we're widening little pieces of letters and stuff like that. And it's arguably for the design team, something that's great and fun, to do. But, the way I handle it is, in this particular case was to send, a note to the person that I did all the negotiations with and have been doing the project management with from the very beginning, just to say like, hey, we're at a point now where we should be making our final decisions on these pieces, and moving into the next part, let me know, just, it was sort of like more matter of fact. There are times when projects get sort of wild and let's say a creative starts in one place and then at round two, it's sort of a redo. At that point, I don't wait. I sort of have that conversation as quickly as I can up front just to say like, hey, this would actually be a restart. We still have another round or two left in us. But I just want to make sure it's clear that this is sort of what we've talked about. And should we not be able to sort of get closer in this next round, that we may have to, talk about additional fees or, round fees. I've also, over time sort of started to put that kind of language in our initial contracts and our estimates to make sure that it's clear that there is an implication that if they can't just go forever. And that there will be a point at which I'm going to sort of police that and have that conversation. But being good partners to our clients is a really important thing. So, in this case, the one I'm thinking about from last week, it's like we're not going to ding people for those small adjustments as a total round, unless it feels like what has happened is that they said yes to one thing, we went an entire experience, and then they flipped, and we're back, and it's kind of like a restart, or they've added scope somehow. And then those conversations for me are very easy. It's like, if you add things after the fact, then it's like, well, that's not what we talked about. So we need to sort of make additional arrangements for it.
Yeah, and to add to that, every project goes out of scope. There's not a single project that doesn't go out of scope. So, even the good ones, they'll go out of scope, and that's okay if we have a healthy relationship with our clients and we're moving along in a way that we feel is progressive. I think it's more or less okay. We're not lawyers, this is not a business of like, lines in the sand. It's how can we move along and feel like everyone is getting what they need from this process.
It's a great point, Juan Carlos. Yeah, thank you for that. There's another question here. I think this might be directed towards both of you. I think Juan Carlos, I know from a creative standpoint, They want to know, what would you tell young creatives are the most important elements to be appealing for representation?
Don't be appealing towards representation. Don't make your book something that you think artist rep wants or needs. Make the work that you want to see in the world, and then you'll probably likely make better work and make yourself happy, and you might find representation. But I need to say something in general. I don't think representation is something that artists really need to like look for. If you find yourself in a place where you're overwhelmed by the amount of work that's coming in and the amount of time you're doing admin work versus creative work, then maybe that's a conversation you should have with yourself. But I know plenty of super successful like illustrators and designers and photographers that don't have a rep at all. And they're totally fine in their well-oiled machine. So it's not something that every artist needs. So it's really, I mean, think about it. You're giving 30% of like your like project fee away. So it's very considered and thoughtful decision. So I'm sure Audrie would agree with me. It's not for everybody. And don't make your book to get rep. That would make your book based on the kind of work you want to make and see in the world.
Yeah. And I, like I said earlier, like it's not, first off, it's not, having a rep is not the end. Like the work that all the artists have to put in to be represented and what they have to maintain is huge. You know, you can't have a rep and then go to sleep. It's like, in fact, I'm probably, I'm more annoying because I'm constantly looking for those new projects and new opportunities to talk about the artist. So it's probably worse in some ways because you constantly have somebody being like, did you do anything new? Do you have anything new for me to show people? Like, and frankly, I think that it's just not, it's one of those things where it should be a progressive build, and it's not like a plug-in and suddenly like getting a rep is not just about like, oh, I have a rep now and suddenly all the projects are going to flow in. It's just, that's just not how it works. I wish it did.
Artists get projects, reps help facilitate that, and they help them manage their careers and the work that's coming in. They're not like, it's not a pipeline of money. That's not what it is. You have to have your own following. You have to make your own work. You have to promote your own work. Artists get the work that they put in the work creating. That's it.
Yeah, Leela has a response here. She says, love the honesty in that response, JC and Audrie. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
I know we're getting close to time here and we still have some questions. I'm going to ask one other question here and then I'll let you both pick maybe which other questions you would like to answer after that. But there was a question here that says, during the time of the pandemic and our social injustice issues we're facing, how important is it for creatives to create something to raise awareness? And are you doing anything creative to address issues?
Yeah, I can jump in for this one. I think artists should make work that speaks to their truth and what they feel like they need to put into the world. And if you're having that internal sort of like build where you like, I want to express something that's topical and that is about the pandemic or about government or around civil rights issues, I think you should make that work, right? And you should share it with the world. So that's a no-brainer. Like all artists should make the work that they feel compelled to make. On our end, from a pandemic standpoint, which is like a different thing, we try to foster collaborations, sort of like isolated collaborations where we're encouraging our artists to collaborate with each other from a distance. So we're not getting anyone sick, but we're still collaborating. It's still, Sunday afternoon is still a collaborative place, and pandemic or not, like we're going to find ways for artists to collaborate. So that's something that we've been sort of pushing really hard on. And in terms of some of the more sort of like social justice issues, that's a conversation that we're having currently internally, as to how best to communicate the interests and the interests of our artists and what they're putting out into the world as it relates to what's currently happening in the world. So allowing them a platform to broadcast their concerns that I'm more or less sure are aligned with Sunday afternoon's stance on things. Is that right, Audrie?
Absolutely, 100%.
Great, thank you very much, Juan Carlos, Audrey. I know we have about 5 minutes left here. If you guys are good to stay on for maybe a couple minutes more, but feel free to, within this Q&A, I know we have another 7 questions. So if you want to maybe pick and choose which ones you want to go through, or if you want to just do like a rapid fire where
Fire away. I can stay
Yeah.
on for a couple
Rapid
minutes.
fire. Let's do it.
Okay. All right. So first question here, do you bid for projects? You already mentioned this a little bit before.
Absolutely.
That's a yes.
Yes.
Okay.
We bid for projects both individually for the artists and then also as a studio.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't pitch, but we bid. There's a difference.
Yeah, we don't want to do free work.
Right.
All right. And then next question here is, what are design type or illustration trends or not trends that bug, annoy, or despise?
That's
Man,
all you.
we need a whole nother Zoom conference for that, I think.
Yeah.
No, to be honest, I'm not really bothered by any particular sort of like style of like design work or typographic work. I'm bothered by people jumping on bandwagons and everyone doing the same kind of work. That bothers me more than any particular style. I think there's a whole like world of typographic and design stuff that should exist in the world. What bothers me is a lack of sort of point of view. When everyone's doing like one look, that's boring, man. Like it's not interesting. So it's not one in particular, it's just bandwagon stuff that bothers me.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. And then Mike McGowan here had a question. Can you show and talk about some work?
Ooh, that would probably be a longer
Right.
Zoom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No worries.
I'd say go through the Sunday afternoon site, and if we have time on this thing on a particular project, we can talk about. But there's too much to like. We'd be here for another like 4 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can talk infinitely about our artists, so and the studio.
Yeah. I know it's like a cop out, but like it's true. We would be here for a while.
And I'll post a link in chat. So for those of you that are tuning in, feel free to check out their work. There's also a link within this Zoom call for the registration email that you received. And then another question here, how do you handle working and collaborating with other creatives, artists, designers that have their own idea, concept, or direction?
I think it's respect. I mean, we wouldn't collaborate with anyone we didn't respect. So if I respect the person, they have a point of view, I'm going to try to go with them on it and see where it takes us. And if it doesn't feel right, raise that flag along the way. But I think having mutual sort of like admiration and respect goes a long way to making good work. Yeah.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. And then next couple questions, I'll go through these very quickly. It says, how important are awards and or works published in design annuals?
This is a tricky one because it means nothing, but it also means something, right? It really depends on what you mean by how important are they. Sometimes they bring in work, you know, they do attract eyeballs from time to time. We've gotten clients based on awards that we've won in the past. We enter awards. Do we hang our hat on them? Do we think that's the end all be all? No, of course not. Like if we don't win, it's like, okay, all good. We're still making work we care about. And that's really what matters at the end of the day, right? Yeah, it really depends on what you mean by important, but we enter and we like, I think what's important for us is that we're seeing how our work is seen and stacked up with our contemporaries. That's important to us. And there's some other sort of more practical reasons why we enter. One, a lot of young designers want to work with award-winning studios because that helps them with their career as well. So we don't want to be selfish, right? Like it would be super selfish of me to like enter all these awards when I was young, won a bunch of shit, and not allow like designers that work with me like the same opportunities. I think that's kind of, that's a just to be like, oh, words don't mean nothing now. I don't know. It meant something for me when I was coming up, and I'm sure it means something for the designers that work with me. So we want to allow them the opportunity. Like, if you make great work and we feel like it's worthy, we're going to enter it on your behalf and on behalf of Sunday Afternoon. I don't know if that answers the question. It's a loaded one. It's a heavy topic. It costs money. Oftentimes you don't win, it's a shot in the dark. You don't know why or how you do win, or if you're gonna. And I think the more people downplay it, the more they just like enter and kind of just live their lives and make the work that the studio should make, the better you are. People who put too much effort, like, or too much concern on like winning or not, that's when it becomes like toxic,
I feel like we, this group in particular, like we have deep connections with the ADC and Young Guns and stuff like that. And through them, it's been also community, which amongst, the design professionals, I feel like that's important, and similar to AIGA, it's like, finding resources within your own community and connection within your own community. And sometimes the awards are just sort of the situation that brings us together.
Yeah, great answers. Thank you for that. There's actually a comment here from Facebook from Manda Villarreal. She wanted to say, can you give advice to someone looking to get into magazine publication, design, illustration? And she says, love your Pride cover.
Oh, thank you. Usually that, like any kind of work that you want to get, I think it's important to show that work in your portfolio, even if it's spec work. So I think I did a fair amount of spec work when I was younger, which allowed me to get some of my work in front of like the people at ESPN and Variety Magazine, who I ended up doing some like typographic work for, which probably led to the cover I did for the New York Times. So, between like doing the spec work, which was probably back in 2011, and the Pride cover I did in 2019, that's a long time, right? But that was me like planting seeds of spec work way back in the day, which led to that project years later. So I would recommend doing a bunch of like spec work for magazines and putting that in your portfolio and allowing that to circulate, and hopefully you get a couple of bites. And when you get a couple of bites, make sure that you're putting in the work and putting in the time, because you might not get another bite. Like, I treat all my projects like it's the most important thing in the fucking world. Like Audrie knows, like it's like it's super important for me to get it right, because I want to do more of it. So yeah,
that's great advice. Thank you. Last three questions that are here before we wrap up. First question up here says, how do you measure success?
I mean, I think it's pretty simple. If you're happy with the work you're making and your clients are happy and they pay you, that's a pretty good way of measuring success. That's really it. And everything else is just like cherry, right? If you win an award, great, that's a cherry on top, great. But success should be measured with like how you feel about the work at the end of the day. Can you go to sleep with the project you made, and do you think about it? Do you wake up thinking about it? Do you go to sleep thinking about it? That's fucking good, man. That makes me happy.
I measure it in that, with the artists that we work with, when they have dream clients, when they have dream projects, how close can we get to doing those? What have we worked on foundationally to facilitate that, and and if we have been successful in getting the right eyes so that those things happen. So when they come in, it's always very exciting.
All right, thank you, Audrie and Juan Carlos. And then last two questions. How do you keep busy when it's slow? And then the second question is on what you said earlier, what would be the main reason to have an agent versus being a freelancer?
How to keep busy when you're slow? I think all creative people should. It seems like a fairly obvious one, but like if you're not making work, then like what are you doing? Like when it's slow, you should be making art. When you're sad, you should be making art. When you're, like every time, like when you're happy, you should make art. Like when you're crying, make art. Like just fucking make work. Like spend that slow time making stuff. Just make as much shit as possible. That's what I would say.
Yeah. And I would say, what's great and what has been, especially around COVID, and is that the conversations that I was having with a good chunk of our roster who was capable of sort of making things, continuing to make things, and then, how they explore all of them, sort of universally started making projects as a part of this experience. And whether it was because we asked them to collaborate with one another or because it was something that they wanted to do on their own, that was the answer. And it was, for me, it was great because it gave us the opportunity to keep talking about their work and their process, and sort of in some cases, provide bright spots and some like really exciting sort of elements, like the Sunday afternoon roster in general are prolific. They will, they make beautiful, amazing things as they go. And those were the questions that I was getting, like, what and how do we lean into, like, what can I be doing right now? And depending on who was asking, I had an answer for them.
Thank you, Audrie.
You have that last question, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Just said, what would be the main reason to have an agent versus being a freelancer? I know Audrie and Juan Carlos, you guys kind of touched on that earlier. Maybe clarify it or maybe sum it up.
I mean, I think being a freelancer, if you have an agent, you're still a freelancer, right? You're freelancing, just kind of, you have to manage like a couple of other things by yourself versus like having an agent, which it can help with managing clients and managing like asking for project fees or doing all those like more admin work that you might not want to spend time doing. There's a lot that Audrie can do and say that I can't say to my clients because it comes across maybe a bit like strong or gauche, might seem a little like, how do I say this, Audrie? I just don't feel like I can say a lot of the things that Audrie can say to my clients on my behalf.
I think that expectation is that when clients are talking to me, they're expecting me to talk to them about money and all of the sort of uncomfortable parts. I think, if you're really comfortable having those conversations and how to advocate for your own work and what you've determined the value is of that work and what the market is sort of dictating, then maybe you don't need an agent. Like that, I've like JC, I know plenty of very successful artists that, their need for an agent when they can do all of the marketing and all of the negotiation and feel very at home doing all of that kind of stuff. Maybe in those cases unnecessary. I have artists that like really don't want to have those conversations or like prefer not to, because what they want to do is remain creative. JC is one of them. Like he wants to be able to go and focus on the creative, and I consider myself a facilitator in that respect. Like I try to, all of the artists are very well aware of all of the conversations I'm having, but you're not required to have those sort of awkward, like, oh, your budget is only X, and it allows us to make the determination that a project is worth doing because of the content of the project versus it being, about that dollar. And then it releases most artists from this feeling of like, well, they don't value me properly. It's like, I can sort of get to the quick on that and feel very comfortable about it and present it back to the artist as like, this is what they're working with. These are the benefits, these are the, the drawbacks, and we can make the determination about that from that standpoint versus it being like, oh, we only have XYZ, and those conversations kind of just suck to have for most people. So, and some artists are, don't care. They're like, yeah, totally fine to have them. And some artists would prefer to be focused only on the creative elements and what they're being asked to do from a designer or a creative perspective. So I guess it just depends on which you are,
Yeah, sure.
Those are both really great answers. And I think in all honesty, that kind of helps to sum up even the content of the discussion today. So between having someone that represents you, that advocates for you and sets those expectations while you know, you, Juan Carlos, and all the other creatives can focus on what you guys do best in that creation of the work that you are making for the clients. So really appreciate your time today. Audrie, Juan Carlos, thank you very much for sharing some insights with our audience today. Both, I know we have people from our AIGA Detroit community. We have people tuning in from around the world that are listening to these Zoom chat sessions that we've been hosting. So thank you to all of you who have tuned in for the comments, the questions, and for the support that you're showing to our creative community during these times. Really appreciate all of your time this afternoon. And thank you again for just kind of opening up, I guess, a little bit of these kind of murky waters around having an agent or a rep or being part of a company and a design studio, giving some insights how you guys started that. I think you even mentioned that, Juan Carlos, that relationship, that's huge. And especially for those young designers that are tuning in, you know, building those relationships take time. Keep creating work for yourselves. And like Audrie mentioned, if you have that talent, but you may necessarily not feel comfortable in having those conversations related to, you know, whether it's the scope or expectations or money, know that agents and reps, they really take care of you in that respect, where you can solely focus on creating. So thank you for sharing that knowledge with us today, and was really happy that we could connect. Thank you, Mikey. I know Mikey's tuning in, so thank you, Mikey, for connecting us. And thank you to both of you. Juan Carlos, enjoy some more paella, and
Yeah.
Audrie, have a great lunch. And
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, and take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great
Bye.
day.